Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm Ted Piccone. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer for the World Justice Project, and we are gathered today to talk about accountable governance and COVID-19, the impact of the pandemic on basic governing institutions and how they function. And we are doing this in the context of our work under the World Justice Challenge, a program that we have run in the past and we are now going virtual. This is a global competition to identify and recognize the best practices and policies and programs around the world that are addressing the impacts of COVID-19 on the rule of law, specifically in 4 areas: on accountable governance, which is the subject of today's talk. Secondly, on access to justice for all. Third, on anti-corruption and open government, and we already held a webinar on that topic. And fourth, on fundamental rights, which we will cover in January, and access to justice we'll do in December. So this is part of a series of work that we are focused on as we all grapple with the impact of the public health crisis on the rule of law around the world. And for the next hour, we'll dig deeper into the topic of accountable governance and specifically the impact of the pandemic on executive powers and constraints on those powers, the role of legislatures, the role of judiciaries, and of course, the role of elections as a check of accountability by the citizens. What we won't cover, but is an important part of accountable governance, is the issue of the role of the media and civil society as additional checks on government power. We'll address that issue in our fundamental rights webinar in January. I want to emphasize that the competition is open. It is currently available on our website to go look at the details, and please check it out. The deadline is December 11th, so less than a month away. And we will then engage in a process of vetting the finalists, vetting the pool toward a group of finalists, and then work with the finalists on showcasing their innovative projects. And then we will choose winners in May of 2021. So more details online. We're joined today and co-sponsored on this theme by International IDEA and the International Legal Assistance Consortium. And we have speakers from both organizations with us. So let me quickly introduce them. But before I do so, just some quick housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded and we will share the recording with everyone who is registered for this event in the next week. Please use the Q&A function for posing your questions. If you can identify specifically who you would like to direct your question to, and we will do our best to make time for that towards the end of the program. If you have resources you want to share with the group, please use the chat function for that purpose. So let me start by introducing Laura Thornton, who's the Director for Global Programs at International IDEA. Laura has spent over 20 years in the field for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in such places as Georgia, Cambodia, and Malaysia. She's an expert on election monitoring, parliamentary oversight, and disinformation. Our second speaker will be Richard Sannerholm. He's the Director of Operations at ILAC and former head of rule of law at the Folke Bernadotte Academy in Sweden. He's worked with law, governance, and public administration reform programs in Ukraine, Philippines, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Kosovo. Our additional speaker, which is new to the program, is Andy Richardson. He is the program manager for parliamentary standards at the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Andy is worked with IPU since 2004 on standards, guidelines, and good practices in parliaments, and among other things, manages their global parliamentary reports. So we will turn to Laura first, and then to Andy, and then to Richard, focusing first on what is the problem here? Is there a problem? What are the problems when it comes to managing the effect of COVID-19 on our governing institutions and rule of law? And then we'll do a second round focus on solutions. How do we, what do we see as promising, innovative ways of dealing with this global pandemic? So on to Laura, and just one more note to start off, which is this question on constraints on executive powers, which I think is very important to think about the role of legislatures in this context, as well as courts. We have certain international standards for regulating emergency powers and striking that balance between security and liberty and protection of rights. And there are various principles and elements which are further elaborated in our policy brief, which is available on our website. But I would just note that these measures that are being taken, many in accordance with the law, many countries already have laws in place to deal with these kinds of emergencies, but many do not. And there was a bit of improvisation, making it up along the way in dealing with the crisis. And there was, I think we can all acknowledge, some excessive, arbitrary, and perhaps unlawful use of emergency powers in the context of the pandemic, and exploiting the emergency for ulterior motives. And the effect that has had in certain populations has been documented by many monitors and observers around the world. So I wanted to identify that as a concern. Another one is that these measures obviously should be time bound, so that there's a constant process of citizen and parliamentary feedback on how these measures are being implemented and enforced. The key political issue that we've seen is, are these measures reasonable? Are they limited? Are they the least restrictive means available to deal with the crisis? And so we've seen such a dramatic reaction around the world on the tools that are being used. Everything from mandates to wear masks, curfews, lockdowns, use of force, and what effect that has had on citizen trust in government and rule of law institutions. So those are my preliminary comments. We'll have more to say about that along the way, and I will now turn to Laura.
Thank you. I will share my screen because I put together some data for this presentation. And I hope that works. There we go. So we at International IDEA, we have actually, to track a lot of the things that we're talking about today, we've looked at the impact of COVID-19 on various democracy and human rights indicators. So we have been tracking this in 162 countries, and we're looking at everything that you laid out in your opening remarks, Ted, from civil rights to freedom of expression, media freedom. In fact, it's information and media freedom that we're seeing some of our most concerning developments, but we've also looked at the subject today of parliament and elections. And we have labeled things as we see concerns or things to watch. Now, with regard to parliaments, so basically we're seeing that almost half of parliaments have made procedural changes to address the new circumstances and the new reality. And often these procedural changes involved changes in the rules of procedure, or even in some cases needing to change the Constitution. For example, in 35% of parliaments surveyed, they had to adapt special procedures to allow for remote meetings. And in addition to that, we've actually seen 34 countries that have completely suspended parliament at one point. We noted that this was more common in authoritarian and hybrid regimes, but also a few democracies did this as well. So COVID has definitely impacted Parliament function. Procedural changes, social distancing, only 12% of the parliaments in our study actually continued with normal procedure. And then we've seen just sort of this range of response from authoritarian and hybrid regimes as well, where some have suspended parliamentary business on the grounds of COVID, while others have done sort of the opposite extreme by pretending everything was normal despite the pandemic and other social problems. I won't go into detail here, but this just demonstrates sort of the range of changes that have been made in parliaments, from reduced quorums to a hybrid system where some people are in parliament and some people are working remotely, social distancing, virtual meetings, etc. In terms of their impact, which is what we want to talk about right now, I mean, as is very clear, Parliament's oversight and scrutiny, particularly in the case of a global emergency, when the executive is declaring a state of emergency, as well as creating very fast-paced regulations, doing a lot of spending, scrutiny is extremely important from the legislative branch. And we have seen parliaments being sidelined in this regard. We've seen it from sort of well-established democracies to transitioning to hybrid. Ireland, for example, wanted to pass a sort of second state of emergency amendments and allocated 45 minutes for parliamentary debate. And there were protests about this. Luckily, there's been some pushback to these grabs. India just canceled question hour. So this issue of scrutiny has been challenged in a number of places. Also, what we've seen is another important function of Parliament, again, particularly in a crisis, is the ability of the legislative body to represent constituents, pass legislation that takes into account very real and immediate health and economic needs. And instead, we've also seen legislation sort of pushed through in these circumstances that wouldn't have survived a real proper parliamentary process. In Nepal, there were efforts to change the Parties Act and the Constitutional Council Act while Parliament was in recess. In Indonesia, they pushed through regulatory legislations and mining bill. You know, in India as well, they passed through really quickly about 25 bills in a matter of 3 sessions because Parliament wasn't up to its normal function. Poland tried to pass restrictive abortion regulations. So we have seen this impact with the government or the ruling party taking advantage of a not quite up to speed parliamentary process. And then even the procedures Parliament's adopted itself, such as a quorum, raises some concerns about, you know, is a quorum a democratic process? Is it ensuring adequate representation of all different views? I think I will save the best practices and innovations sort of for the next round, because we have seen also some positive developments in this regard. But I will stop there and pass to Andy.
Excellent. Andy, on to you. Further analysis of what the impact has been on parliaments.
Well, thank you very much. And I think probably at the outset, it's worth recalling that when we're discussing oversight in the context of the pandemic, then yeah, this is just a subset of Parliament's overall capacity to oversee the government and to hold the government to account. In 2017, the IPU published with UNDP a global parliamentary report on parliamentary oversight, drawing on contributions from more than 100 parliaments. And we were able to observe a very wide variation in existing parliamentary powers, capacity, and practice to carry out oversight in normal times. And the discussions with parliaments drew out a number of very fundamental elements for effective oversight. The importance of clearly established rules that are agreed and accepted by all players, the role of the opposition, of course, the relations between Parliament and other oversight bodies such as Supreme Audit institutions, but also underlying all of this, the political culture in each country and the environment in which Parliament operates. Oversight is very much a question of relational power, the power of the legislature to put checks on the executive, or contrary, the power of the executive to act without constraint. So it's clearly a picture where there is still much, parliaments themselves are taking up this oversight role, but there's still much to be done, and the report makes a number of recommendations in that direction. So during the pandemic, the first thing was to get parliaments functioning. And as Laura has observed, in a way, we can note that a very large number of parliaments were able to respond quickly in order to be able to meet in the new circumstances. And I guess moving on from that point, so the lights are on, parliaments have been responsive, but within that, parliamentary functioning is still disturbed. The social distancing measures that all parliaments are now obliged to follow inevitably change the dynamic, including the dynamic for holding ministers to account, the ability to receive information directly from ministers, the ability to question ministers and to make them feel the weight of parliamentary questioning is undoubtedly different as a result of the way parliaments have needed to adapt, whether they have less people in the chamber or parliamentarians spread across different locations in Parliament or in different places. It's a process that is still underway of resuming a way to function, including both the legislative and oversight functions of Parliament in the pandemic. So I'll save the examples maybe for a second round.
Okay. Great, thank you, Andy. And everyone who has rejoined us, thank you for sticking with us after this little technical hiccup. We continue to monitor the chat and Q&A, so feel free to join the conversation as we turn to Richard Sannerholm from ILAC, impact of the pandemic on the judiciary systems.
Okay, thank you so much, Ted. Hopefully this works without technical glitches now then. But first I have a general comment on COVID-19 pandemic, which actually has bearing on my reflections on the impact for the judiciary. And that is that there's an additional element to this crisis we're in compared to others that stands out, and that's time. Crises typically are short-lived. They erupt and they die out. But with COVID-19, there is no, at this date, end date in sight. So unpredictability is becoming the norm. And so for governance systems, they must navigate this new landscape, and that involves also the judiciary. We see the impact on the judiciary in this regard. So what is being tested is therefore not so much, as you referred to as well, Ted, in the beginning, how governments react to the crisis, but more how they manage the crisis, and to do so over time, but also attempting to maintain normal governance functions. And for the judiciary, there's this saying in politics that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And this is true for COVID-19 as well. The rule of law was in retreat in many countries well before COVID pandemic became a fact. So with the pushback on rule of law in many different settings, together with the element of time, it creates a very precarious situation for judiciary as a pillar in the architecture of accountable government. And it also means that the international rule of law community, actors such as World Justice Project or ILAC or IDEA and others, also have to adjust and attune the tools you use in order to monitor these changes in this new landscape. And so what do we know about the effects for COVID-19 on the judiciary? Well, there has been some major shifts in countries where there's been emergency laws being used to the extreme, and in other ways freedom of expression has been curtailed and so on and so forth. But courts have had an important role to play. But the main trend we see from our point of view here at ILAC is the smaller or lesser harm that's being done to rule of law on an everyday basis as an impact from COVID-19. And that this is a trend that you clearly see when you look at judicial institutions. So we have a forthcoming ILAC report that's being carried out by the Cyrus R. Vance Center for International Justice of the New York City Bar Association, where we examine and look at COVID-19 challenges to the judiciary in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it builds on interviews with judges from 13 different countries. And what we see here is a worrying trend reporting from the report from judges is the regards the architecture of the judiciary and specifically the proper funding of courts. So with only a few exceptions in the countries that we look at in that report, judiciaries have noted, reported back on having to adopt austerity measures to reduce spending, and even in some countries to return already allocated funds from the approved budget. Now, it's difficult to assess what this means for the respective judiciaries on a long-term basis, or whether funding will swing back to pre-COVID-19 levels. But for the judiciaries that were already struggling with resources or being under-resourced, we see a long-term risk that is considerably higher and a setback of operative capacity is expected. So it is also a concern that the durability of the pandemic will set precedents for how judiciaries are resourced, and that funding may become less predictable in that sense. So what is also clear from the data coming in from that report on Latin America and the Caribbean is that the judiciaries initially assumed great responsibility, taking a great responsibility in terms of suspending or scaling down activities, except for the most urgent cases, in order to minimize the spread of the virus. And that they have since wrestled with finding a new normal under difficult circumstances. And a trend in the countries covered in the report that's coming out in a few weeks is that finding a new normal has involved using digital means. So the courts across the region have resorted to remote hearing and digital solutions. And that this shows sort of adaptability to the pandemic, given the right tools and resources. But also in some instances where judges or judiciaries have had to use personal equipment in order to meet the basic standards of fair trial and access to justice. And this, of course, raises issues on data security and privacy rights, among others. And then we have another report from ILAC, which is also on the way, which looks at how rule of law and judiciary has been affected by COVID-19, but from the point of view of vulnerable groups. And here we draw on the countries of Tunisia, Libya, and Palestine. And the tentative results from these three countries are quite distressing in the sense of how different small, lesser harms have serious consequences for individuals. We see a justice debt being accumulated in Tunisia, Libya, and Palestine from the scaling down of judicial activities. And then how that has affected the vulnerable groups, in particular in cases such as alimony, child custody, or visitation rights. So many women have been set in financial hardship. There's no resolution on alimony cases, for example. Pre-trial detainees can't access legal counsel because there are concerns about the health regimen at custodial institutions or in prisons. And courts generally in these three countries struggle, and they did struggle even before the pandemic, with a backlog of cases. And they are now operating in some instances under or with a severely reduced capacity. We also see, finally, as a note on outlining some of the challenges, that domestic violence cases it's a spike in those cases. And this is not isolated to these three countries that we cover in that report, but seems to be globally due to restrictions and curfews. But what's reported in cases from Libya and Palestine and Tunisia are issues where women do file complaints about domestic violence. They do so without access to legal counsel because it's been restricted as part of COVID-19 or impacted by that. And when they do file without legal counsel, a consequence is that they meet recalcitrant police or being persuaded to drop their claims on domestic abuse. So this is a very short summary of larger issues, but the uniting trend here is that these are sort of lesser or smaller harms, not the major shifts in terms of emergency powers or the judges or judiciaries working as checks and balances, but how this actually affects the small time changes over time in a pandemic that we don't know will end. So it's a matter of keeping a close eye on these changes. So I'll stop there and happy to pick up later in the conversation on some of the best practices and adaptability of the judiciary as well.
Thank you, Richard. Having the specific examples from different countries is very useful. And thinking about the impact on vulnerable groups, also very, very valuable. Also, I'm thinking about folks that are already caught up in the criminal justice system as pretrial detainees or who are awaiting trial and will be waiting for many, many more months. So we really do have an impact on fundamental rights to fair and speedy trial issues here, among other cases. What I want to do now is come back to the popular accountability issues, elections, in accordance with the law. And I'm going to ask Laura to give us some slides on that as well.
Great. Okay, here I go again on elections. All right. So elections. Elections have been very much affected by this pandemic, as we've seen around the world. In fact, I have to keep checking our global monitor because the numbers just keep changing every day. So we've had 185 election processes by my last check that have been affected. 93 have been postponed, and then almost more than half have been subsequently held. 92 were held on schedule. What's interesting is that actually postponement's happening less and less. It might, given the rise in COVID cases recently, that might change again. But as sort of countries have adapted to the pandemic and learned from other countries that have held elections during the pandemic, we've seen that that's a less common option for people. So if you're looking at it from a sort of, this is by country. So 73 countries and territories have had elections postponed. You can see this is pretty evenly spread throughout the globe. Middle East less so, fewer elections. And 89 countries and territories have held national and subnational elections. This is our most recent data. What's interesting is to look at some slight differences between authoritarian democracy and hybrid regimes. And particularly initially, democracies were actually most likely to postpone and reschedule. But the important point that you talked about at the beginning is about being time bound and having a very clear date. And even if that was postponed again, there was transparency in that decision. Interestingly, hybrid regimes were more likely when they postponed not to name a new date. So really with elections, there's sort of two big questions. The first one is if, do you hold it? And this decision in and of itself has created tremendous problems and discord around the world, particularly when this has been done without political consensus. So if you take a place like Burundi, where the government pushed forward with elections and the opposition was against this, most of civil society was, there were even protests, and international observers couldn't get to the country, and the election results were disputed. The state of Wisconsin in the spring also had difficulties because you had a governor and a state legislature from different parties disagreeing on whether to postpone or hold, and therefore holding an election without sufficient safeguards in place and a little bit of confusion. Sri Lanka actually dissolved parliament and then kept postponing elections, which meant there was just no parliament for several months. And then there have been cases where there's been at least allegations that these are done for purely partisan reasons, right? So if the ruling party was particularly popular at that moment, let's rush through with an early election as they did in Croatia, because after some period of time, perhaps the popularity of the government would drop. So this has been a huge problem. And then once you've made a decision to hold an election, the question becomes how? And so special voting arrangements like mail-in voting, early voting, mobile voting, these things are really difficult to implement if they haven't existed in some form already. So we saw that countries that had at least had mail-in voting or absentee voting, it's easier for them to scale up than a country to introduce something new from the get-go. There's also, of course, huge resources and infrastructure problems. You have to have safety equipment, space to allow social distancing, to hold a safe election. And this has created tremendous problems in many places, including large queues because of a lack of proper infrastructure and ability to socially distance. And then, of course, there are legal obstacles. Oftentimes, it's just not legal to postpone an election. In France, the municipal elections, for example, the first round, there was agreement, political consensus that there should be a postponement, but they legally couldn't. So they had to rush through legislation to then postpone the second round. So all of these gaps and weaknesses, they create controversy and confusion and can erode trust. So we saw, for example, problems in Poland where they just implemented mail-in voting, but without consultation. So people became very confused. In the US, we saw litigation all over about how to do mail-in voting and disagreements about when you could start counting the ballots that came in. Then you've also had problems related to disenfranchisement of people in quarantine and people with COVID themselves. And then there've also been cases of people getting sick as a result of an election exercise. Now, turnout is actually sort of interesting. I mean, I'm a glass half full kind of gal, but so I think this is actually not bad. I know this is hard to read, but basically the red bar is elections before COVID, the last 10 years. And then the blue bar are COVID elections. And certainly turnout is lower. There's no question. I mean, you can see particularly in France, Syria, Taiwan, I mean, you see lower turnout. But for the most part, it's not as awful as I would have expected, which really speaks to people's real dedication to exercise their franchise. And they're put in an impossible position between choosing between their health and franchise. So again, I guess I'll save those best practices for the next round because there are some that I'd like to share.
Well, actually,
just go ahead?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Because that's a good segue. You've got the slides up, and let's do it that way. So we're going to turn now. We've gone through a round of identifying some of the problems. What are some innovative solutions and how have authorities responded in the judiciary, in the parliament, in the election systems? Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, so I'll start with, I'll keep going on elections and I'll go back to parliament if that's okay. I think we've seen some real just efficiencies here, and it mostly boiled down to rapid interagency cooperation, political consensus, and competency. And South Korea really was one of the early sort of shining stars in this regard because they held massive parliamentary elections. They had early and home voting. In particular, they had a very clear communication strategy. They were talking to citizens all the time, telling them exactly how the process was going to go. They had massive health safety provisions put into place. They had live streams from the polling station for observers. So they really sort of jumped into action. And we've seen, I won't go through all these countries, but several countries from drive-through voting in the Czech Republic to mobile ballot boxes. There have been some good practices. And that's particularly why actually I think there's been less postponement of elections is because we've looked to the countries that went first and are trying to pick up on some of those practices. But I think so the lessons I would say here is that there's a definite need for sort of periodic and systematic review of rules that govern elections for the reasons I just outlined. Make sure the legislative framework is in place because we need to prepare for the next crisis, whether it's a pandemic or climate change consequences or natural disaster. So having a legislative framework that allows you to do things like postpone, that allows special voting arrangements to take place. That should be put in place early on, safe polling procedures and health precautions. But I think the more elusive and important lessons are the countries that fared better and held better elections were those that had inclusive, transparent decision-making process and had agreement of the main political players. The countries that performed poorly here is where there was conflict. As I mentioned, cross-agency cooperation is essential. Election management bodies are just one piece of this puzzle. You need legislatures, you need other bodies to ensure that this happens, coordination with various safe and health bodies as well. And then also trust. As usual, we circle back to the issue of trust. election institutions that already had very stable, trusted practices fared better than those that are shouted in doubt or very polarized. I can go back, if you don't mind, just quickly to some of the best practices now on Parliament that we came across in our research, and I'm sure Andy has extra things to add here. But in terms of adapting to the new normal, how do you enhance scrutiny of COVID? And some countries have really responded well to this. There have been 35 countries, for example, that have instituted special committees to look specifically at COVID response. In New Zealand, this is led by the opposition to ensure minority rights within the legislative body. There have been special inquiries. 7 countries have had special inquiries through the committee process, like Trinidad and Tobago. Norway actually passed a Corona Act, which allows the minority to actually revoke government regulations related to COVID. So there has been some movement there. And I think that parliaments have also done a pretty good job in some places to respond to the need for citizen participation, because virtual parliaments really miss out on that important ingredient of constituent work. That's a very tactile, that's a very in-person activity. So for example, Brazil has created these opportunities for feedback by creating a virtual commentary on proceedings. They set up a software that allowed citizens to comment on things. And then there's been voting software for MPs as well, so that they can vote from a distance on various legislation, and even educational activities. The Czech Republic, for example, put in this massive portal that did, tours of Parliament and live streaming and different classes. So there have been some important innovations. But I think what we've learned is that the virtual processes really work best when they deepen and strengthen in person rather than replace them. So we've seen committee work is quite suited to partial virtualization. It actually helped get more expert and citizen input for testimony. It fits into a more environmentally friendly agenda. But, again, it can't replace in-person. Virtual sessions also give a lot of power to the speaker, committee chair, who controls that mute button. Makes it harder for offices, let alone media interaction. So, while we may keep some of these innovations, which I hope we do, to expand participation, for example, or make it more flexible for MPs to work from afar, ultimately parliamentary democracy is still in the public domain, and the virtual platforms simply don't have yet, at least, the characteristics to make this happen. And that in-person interaction, particularly for the importance of representative constituent work, I think will continue. So I will stop there and let my esteemed panelists weigh in on this as well.
That's great, Laura. And there's a lot of interest in the chat to share your slides. I don't know if you can do that, but
yes. Of course, and also the global monitor, I can put up the link again, because you can just click on different countries and you can get a lot of different information there.
So what we'll do after the event, and when we send around a recording, we'll perhaps include your slides in that. So thank you for all of that. Really interesting and detailed information. Andy, if we could turn to you and hear a little bit more about your insights on how parliaments are responding to the crisis. I would just note one thing on the virtualization and the idea of more open government, opening these spaces to more people to tune in. That assumes that we have the technology in place to allow people to join these discussions. And it's also relating to the judiciary. Generally trials are open to the public, as they should be. But a number of courts do not have the technology to make that available to the public and the media. And there's been a restriction on public access to those government beings. But Andy, let me turn to you next.
Ted, and in a way, I'm going to build on some of the points that Laura was making that I fully subscribe to as well. She referenced special parliamentary committees with interesting differences between them. New Zealand's special COVID committee operated entirely online via Zoom. Ireland's special committee met in person, although in a different room from the regular committee setting to allow for social distancing. Laura also referenced Brazil, which to our mind was one of the first and fastest responders, that they were able to hold a plenary sitting with 500 members taking part remotely within 2 weeks of the arrival of the pandemic. And this is because they have an incredibly strong firstly commitment to public engagement, and secondly technology infrastructure that they were able to leverage to do the kind of things that Laura referenced. A couple of different examples of let's say good practices in Parliament. So for example, to have fixed end dates for emergency laws, such as in Canada, where the opposition agreed to give members the ability, give ministers, sorry, the ability to change certain legislation, for example, on social benefits without parliamentary approval, as long as their specific end dates are provided for, or that these emergency laws expire within a set period of time. Another different example would be providing the executive with freedom to carry out additional spending, but with caps or limits on that spending. In Australia, for example, advances to the finance minister, which funded urgent expenditure without parliamentary approval, they've increased massively, but the opposition negotiated that the finance minister would need to consult them on expenditures over a certain amount. But the reality is that it's a challenging environment and for parliaments, and we have seen also a huge increase in the use of executive power to manage the pandemic. For example, the use of statutory instruments in the United Kingdom to allow the government to make law subject to review of Parliament. But these statutory instruments would be firstly so numerous, it's difficult to scrutinise, but also changing very rapidly. So parliamentary scrutiny became very, very difficult. I think it is worth looking forward, because many parliaments through this experience have had a set of have come across working methods that may be here to stay and may have an impact on the functioning of Parliament, but also the place of Parliament and its interaction with citizens. So I definitely subscribe to Laura's comment on the point being to use virtual to extend and deepen in-person contacts, not to replace it. But we're seeing parliaments that are recognizing that, particularly in countries that have a constituency-based system where parliamentarians need to spend time both in the capital for parliamentary sittings and in their constituency for their work with constituents, the possibility of holding remote sessions, whether of the plenary or the committee, will perhaps become a more institutionalized practice, so that MPs can be in their constituency, be grounded in the local realities, and still contribute to parliamentary business. Remote voting was already coming up as, particularly in the context of more family-friendly policies, to allow young parents or parents with young children to continue their work as parliamentarians. Obviously, remote sittings support that kind of interaction. And the virtualization of committee hearings opens up a potential for hearing from a wider group of people who are not able to travel physically to the capital city to meet with the committee. would be able, if the Parliament is willing in that, to move in that direction, to take part in committee hearings virtually. And finally, I think Laura hit the nail on the head by looking at the role of parliamentarians, which is very fundamentally to be in contact with people locally in discussions all day, every day. And that has inevitably been changed by social distancing measures, and it remains to be seen how long that obstacle to the regular functioning of a parliamentarian will remain in place, because it can only be damaging. Of course, it shifts people to working online, but it's a different relationship and interacting with a different set of people. Thanks.
Yeah, very good. I really appreciate the way both Laura and Andy have emphasized this point of technology as a way to expand interaction with the public and with citizens, but not to replace. And I think this is one of the silver linings we're finding across the board, that as people get more plugged into the digital world and the technology is diffused and available for these kinds of meetings to take place, committees or otherwise, that we will perhaps see a greater citizen and public input in our legislative process. So there's a positive, glass half full to think about. Of course, many countries do not have the technology for this purpose, let alone citizens being able to tap into some kind of remote hearing. So I think for donors, for governments that are interested in building on the positive of this crisis, I would say that's an investment that really should be explored and deepened on diffusion of technology in our governing systems. Let me turn to Richard and for his comments on the solution side. I do want to just say, because of our little technology, speaking of technology hiccup, we will have to end right at 11. So over to you, Richard, and then we'll see if we have time for Q&A.
I'll keep it fairly short then, but two positive aspects coming through. First one, and this is the less concrete one, when looking at the Latin America and Caribbean and the three countries I mentioned in the Middle East, and really stands out, is the human ingenuity, and within the group of legal professionals, you don't always associate the two, in trying to find adaptive ways of both sort of meeting the crisis and then trying to manage it. And this relates then to how judges have set new schedules around hearings, or lawyers have reached out to vulnerable groups in terms of sharing information and so on. And this relies in some part on tech, and in others it doesn't. But I think it's important to point that out and say, well, we could capitalize on this as well, this kind of adaptability. And it relates to these smaller or lesser changes to the legal system, or challenges to the rule of law, to which the legal groups in various countries have reacted to in a very positive way. I think on the second aspect, which is more concrete, and that's digitalization, so the use of digital means for conducting hearings, for example, conducting the digital means have been introduced without the proper due diligence work you do when you introduce new technology in high-risk sectors and high-risk areas. So that has to come along or follow through. And I think what we're looking at here is something that is for the long run in terms of the pandemic. And digitalization is not something that's going away once you introduce it either. There's a strong cost efficiency argument behind it. The cost efficiency is also important, but from a legal and lawyer point of view, so the organization I represent, we also mentioned, well, data security, privacy rights, and basic fair trial standards. So we have to find an equation, a balance there as well. And this is where the international community, the owners organization, can be fruitful in terms of helping and making sure that digital means that all have already been introduced are then packaged in a legal regulatory framework that allow for good security measures. Because it starts as a coping, but it's here to stay. So that's the devil's advocate or glasses half full point of view on that one. Just a final note on two things looking forward. I think it's important to move beyond, or to maintain two things, or two thoughts in mind. And that is to look at from the point of view of the judiciary. The judiciary is an important pillar when it comes to making sure that both parliaments, but the executive in particular, do what they say they should according to the law. That's the main purpose of rule of law. Minimize arbitrary power wherever power is exercised. That's one, but also maintain the ability to move beyond that and look at these smaller gradual changes that take place over time. That sometimes also happens as a default because of coping strategies or mechanisms. They sometimes fly under the radar because they're small and incremental, but over time accumulate depths in various ways. And lastly, I think what comes out and stands up, particularly from the study on Palestine, Libya, and Tunisia, is the issue on legal representation and access to legal aid, in particular for vulnerable groups, particularly caused by the effects of pandemic in issues like domestic abuse. That's a crucial issue in moving forward, and that's something that the donor community can do something about. Thank you.
Those are excellent points, reminding us of digitalization with equity, and also concerns about right to privacy and making sure that we have security systems in place for protecting citizens' right to privacy. I think that's a key point. We're running out of time, but one of the questions that came up, and maybe this is for you, Richard, in the chat box, is alternative dispute resolution. So, this is a low-tech solution for places where it's going to take too long for the system to respond, the judicial system to resolve conflicts or disputes. Do you see any trends or uptick there in finding alternative dispute resolution mechanisms?
Perhaps I'm saying too much now. The colleagues listening in will be angry with me because the reports are being formatted and due to be published soon. But I don't think that this has come up in these particular region and countries that we've covered. But certainly ADR in various shapes and forms is a good way of alleviating some of the burden of the court system for cases also that perhaps shouldn't go to a proper litigation in the sense of a judicial hearing, but can be settled through other means. So it's always worth exploring that in cases of countries where you have an accumulated justice debt of various kinds. And for some areas, it fits better than others. But we haven't seen it particularly in this in the reports that I referred to.
Any final comments as we wrap up, Laura or Andy, on what we've raised? Any 1-minute takeaways?
I don't have too much to add. I mean, we could talk about the issue of trust for forever, because I think that's this elusive thing that has been at the bottom of successful institutional response, and the hardest to develop. Another point that I think sometimes gets lost is that we often look at, particularly when we're talking about like parliaments and elections, as a very technical exercise. And the political aspect here, which is also how does just democracy work 6 feet apart? And if that is our life for some time to come, how does that affect different political power centers? If you're campaigning and you don't have the bully pulpit of being in government and the media that comes with that, and you can't go door to door, what impact does that have? If you're a young MP and you want to represent your constituency and you're majoritarian, how do you do that effectively if you're not, more connected maybe with the government? I see some issues that haven't quite been resolved, as others have said, by just simply going online, particularly if you live in a country. I used to live in Cambodia. You can't, it's not like everyone can whip out their smartphone and join a teletown hall. So I think that these are things we just really need to be conscious of when we think through solutions. Don't ignore the sort of the political ramifications, and some of the things we can do might benefit one side over another, and also to be mindful of resources and varying levels of access in different parts of the country, different parts of the globe.
Great, yeah, making sure we keep in mind this key question of trust in government and how governments are responding to the pandemic, first of all, and then how our political institutions and rule of law institutions are functioning is critical to that as well. Andy, do you want to make any final words as we wrap up?
Well, maybe simply just to observe how at a time of crisis, the role of the state is incredibly important, and the role of the different institutions within the different state institutions, the different branches of government becomes clear just how fundamental it is, for example, to be able to oversee decisions that are being made very quickly on the basis of limited information, and there just needs to be mechanisms for those decisions to be questioned, challenged, and changed as needed. And of course, the media plays an important, vital role in this, but other institutions, the Parliament and the courts as well. So in a way, it's underlining just how important these systems are, and no doubt also drawing attention to some of the gaps in the way these systems function, but not undermining the function itself.
So the global pandemic has really been a shock to our governing institutions and the challenge ever present of accountability. And this issue of cumulative effects, that some of this is going to get normalized bit by bit, some for good, some for bad, and a constant process of evaluation of what works and what doesn't, with rule of law and democratic accountability principles in mind. I think we've covered this very, very well in terms of an overview. Lots of resources available on our website with our partners here at International IDEA and ILAC, and IPU has also its monitoring report. So I encourage everyone to look at those. I want to thank again our panelists for taking the time to join us in this hour program, and just emphasize again, we encourage people to look at the World Justice Challenge website. There's a link in the chat box, but just Google World Justice Project and there'll be on our banner page a link to the challenge. Deadline is December 11th. Lots of other supporting materials. Thank you for putting up with our technology problems today, and we'll send around a recording, and hopefully with the slides and any other materials that our partners want to share on this topic. Until next time, our next webinar will be next month on access to justice. Signing off. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.